tonight that opposition with few administrative duties gives more time for study and thought. It must be regarded as a great constructive period in the life of a party, properly considered, not a period in the wilderness, but a period of preparation for the higher responsibilities which you hope will come. Indeed. He also saw the duty of the opposition as not being reactionary, just opposing for the sake of opposition, but to be judicious and really try and improve the government's ideas and legislation. And following the death of Ben Chifley in 1951, Menzies gave a radio broadcast in his honour, and it was quite a feature of Menzies were his relationships across party lines. He had an extremely close relationship with John Curtin, a very good relationship with Ben Chifley. I'd say an average relationship with Doc Evatt. A story for another day. But in this radio broadcast, honouring Ben Chifley, Menzies said, "Parliament is our great expression of democracy. Parliament is both an instrument of reasoned progress, largely because there are both government and opposition, the hammer and the anvil, forging ideas and making laws." But tonight, you're not here to hear from me, although I can understand you would be a bit. We're here to hear from Senator Simon Birmingham. And I actually can think of no better person to launch this book, The Art of Opposition, than Simon. He is one of the opposition's most senior figures, currently serving as Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs and leader of the opposition in the Senate. He has served as Minister in the government in several portfolios, as Minister for Education and Training, Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment, and Minister for Finance. And he was also leader of the government in the Senate. As I mentioned before, I had the pleasure of getting to know Simon when I was living in Adelaide in 2018-19 on the hustings with him as I attempted to win the seat of Mayo. Yes, I failed, that's why I'm here. And I can attest that Simon is one of the most unflappable advocates for his side of politics, and he's always courteous and respectful, which is, I think, very true to the Menzies tradition. I'd like to now pass to Simon Birmingham while I pick up the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgina, for those kind words, that introduction and the opportunity to be here at the Robert Menzies Institute, and congratulations for all that you have done in helping to make the Robert Menzies Institute a reality, make it the important contributor to history, to debate, to knowledge in our country, and of course in doing so carrying forward the values, the legacy, the philosophy of our party's great founder. And Georgina, I wish you weren't here, of course. I would much rather have had you as the member for Mayo. But as somebody who so successfully on my part took a highly marginal Liberal seat and turned it into an even more marginal Labor seat on my first electoral outing, hope springs eternal always. Thank you all very much for being here as friends of the Institute, as those interested in the art of opposition, as friends of, no doubt, of Dr. Prasser and of contributors who are here. And Scott, thank you for the kind invitation from yourself and David as editors of the book to be able to speak at the launch and for the work that you have done, and work in many different guises over many years. And Scott and I particularly came to know one another when I partially inherited Scott as an advisor in the education portfolio, but I like to think that we did some great things there together. I had a notable birthday last week, and on Saturday night I celebrated in good style. Thankfully no videos have emerged yet, but I had an acoustic guitarist who I'd booked to come and perform. And a lovely guy, he turned up and introduced himself to me as a school teacher, which I didn't know was his daytime job. And he said, "I just wanted to carry a message from my principal, thanking you for your work on bringing the phonics check to South Australia. So there you go, Scott. Work together carries through in the most unexpected of ways. To other contributors who are here, to Liz, to Terry, and of course Dr. David Kemp, great stalwart historian, record keeper, contributor, and of course standout former Education Minister. It is wonderful to have you here and always an honour to be in your presence. Now, I do normally start events by saying what a pleasure it is to be here, and of course in such a room it does feel like a pleasure. But assuming my status as Leader of the Opposition in the Senate is a reason for me to have been invited to speak, then I am here with slightly mixed blessings. Because as Georgina touched upon, it's not the role that one aspires to have in politics. Now, I have had quite a blessed and fortunate career, 17 plus years now in the Australian Senate, 10 of those in government and 9 of those as a minister of some description. I transitioned from government as a very new junior Howard government backbencher, joining in the last 7 months of the government, into opposition, then as a hungry young opposition backbencher, bracing as I was for a potential decade or so in opposition, based on the experiences of those through the Howard and Hawke years. Then I found myself moving from opposition back to government as a junior minister, coming to government much sooner than expected, ready to restore a stability to politics that proved much harder to secure than we had expected at that time. But those years went by, portfolios went by, ministries where I like to think, despite the challenges we faced, we made significant achievements. And then, as Leader of the government in the Senate, I found myself moving back to opposition 2 years ago and literally doing an office swap and a seat swap with Penny Wong from the Leader of the government in the Senate's office and seat into the Leader of the opposition in the Senate's office and seat in the chamber. Opposition is variously a place of opportunity, especially for, I look back, that hungry young backbencher of 17 years ago. But it is also a wretched place, a dispiriting place, and can be even more so when you have had that opportunity to contribute in the ministry and with your hands on the levers of power. Most of all, though, opposition is what oppositions make of it. And I think that truism comes through in spades in the fine volume that we launched tonight. Is the role of opposition one of critical scrutiny of government, one of alternate policy and opinion, or one of seizing electoral advantage and opportunity? What role is there for point scoring versus vision, for careful deliberation versus calculated electioneering, for adherence to philosophical conviction versus pragmatic reality of the politics of the day? If we're being honest with ourselves, in truth, there are bits of all of the above. As Nigel Fletcher writes in the book, the role of a loyal opposition, I've been a member of both Her Majesty's and His Majesty's loyal opposition, combines insurgency with responsibility and dissent with respect. And the weighting each opposition gives to its different tasks and its different responsibilities will always vary with time and circumstance. Yet each of those various functions of an opposition must be carefully weighed by its leadership and continuously weighed by that leadership if they are to have a successful strategy of contributing as an opposition, as parliamentarians, to the nation, but as also of being successful as parliamentarians, as members of a party, as part of a team, to the success of that team and the implementation of its values, its policies, and its ideology. Before returning a little to the role of opposition, I want to reflect that one of the most important points I think made in this book is what having a formal, structured opposition says about a society. Opposition as we know it, and as is most commonly considered in this book through the lens of the Westminster traditions, is far from a universal concept or one that has existed for time immemorial. It has and will continue to evolve as a concept too. But its very existence, in the way that it exists in countries like ours, speaks volumes. Graham Maddox rightly highlights this in the beginning of one of the essays in the book, stating that as those with power tolerate opposing views, so a society becomes a tolerant one. Now, the adversarial nature of our Westminster system means that it doesn't always feel that way. Opposing views can create a sense of divisiveness, and within that, it can feel like we are not promoting the sense of tolerance. But if we stand back and weigh that system of parliamentary democracy with its formalised structure of opposition against the alternatives that exist throughout the world, there can be little bit disputing that our systems of enabling and formalising dissent around an alternative government has created not just more tolerant societies, but also more innovative, entrepreneurial and inclusive ones, all of which driven because the challenge of ideas, the scope for new thinking is enabled and spaces created through that type of democratic structure. An important part of this work is the contemplation not only of the differences of formal opposition structures across different jurisdictions, and there's a little bit of something for everybody there, across the United States and the United Kingdom and Canada, as well as various jurisdictions of Australia, but also, importantly, some critical reflection on the role of upper houses. Now, naturally, I'm biased, both on upper houses and particularly the Australian Senate. Has the Senate emerged as a permanent opposition, as is posited by none other than Dr. Prasser in Chapter 6? Certainly in exercising the function of critically scrutinising government's legislation, government spending, government performance, there is no parliamentary chamber, I would argue, as powerful or effective in Australia as the Senate. That role of scrutiny is certainly led by the Australian Senate. But does the chamber itself behave as an opposition? On that, I have to say the answer is no. While the composition will always be the ultimate determinant of how oppositionist the Senate is, or to borrow from a certain somebody else whose name I won't mention in here, how unrepresentative swill the Senate can be, there will always be many other factors that actually influence that oppositionist tendency or otherwise of the Senate. Scott's contrast of successful Senate passage for Howard-era reforms in fields of industrial relations, or of course tax reform and the implementation of the GST, when contrasted with some of those that I witnessed firsthand in the Abbott era, with obstruction to attempted reforms, to university deregulation and fee structures, or to Medicare co-payments, is quite instructive in thinking about how to get outcomes through and from the Senate. Clearly, mandate plays a very big role, potentially, in being able to achieve that when dealing with disparate crossbenchers and others. To deviate briefly to the current day, and literally the current day, there should now be no doubt that if elected, a Dutton government will come to power with a very clear mandate on nuclear energy, and that in itself will necessitate careful consideration by all non-government senators of the day if and when legislation is brought to bear to give effect to those policies. Now, ultimately, upper houses perform some functions of an opposition, and they are an important tool for oppositions, a very important tool for oppositions. And some governments will feel like upper houses, and particularly the Senate, is an opposition. But in reality, when governments are doing their job and prosecuting their job well, they will never exist in the same way as a permanent opposition. Again, the book importantly touches, though, on some of the ways in which politics as we know it across Western democracies currently feels challenged. As industry and technology go through periods of immense disruption, so too does politics. Parties and or parliaments in different democracies around the world are starting to look less and less like the traditional approaches that we had become accustomed to, particularly those approaches that existed through much of the post-war consensus period. Rodney Tiffin highlights the roles of public cynicism and media fragmentation in driving this disruption. And one of the arts of opposition is, of course, to drive cynicism towards the government of the day. Yet over time, the risk of being excessively effective in that regard from all sides of politics is that it becomes the pox on all your houses. Effective opposition tactics by all major parties in systems like ours could, if we are not careful, ultimately be self-defeating for some or all of those major parties. Short-termism versus a long-term focus is a challenge throughout our governments and our systems. But in this day and age of algorithm-driven media consumption, it is more and more reinforcing existing views or prejudices, reducing the critical analysis of ideas or policies by experts or scholars or even by formal oppositions, reducing such critical analysis down to catchy TikToks or snappy YouTube shorts. Brendan McCaffrey in Chapter 8, reflecting on the outcome of the last federal election and the small target strategy deployed by Mr Albanese, but the small vote attained also by Mr Albanese in his shift to government, notes that a politics in which both major parties' traditional supporters have palatable alternatives to vote for is one in which the major parties will need to work harder for those supporters. That goes to not so much the critical analysis and scrutiny role of oppositions, but of course importantly, the role of oppositions in presenting an alternative, and a positive alternative at that. And Mr Albanese, in his small target approach, avoided the presentation of a positive alternative, sought to make the election more of a referendum on the previous government, and in doing so, created an environment where the cynicism of towards both major parties flourished in a way that of course drove the non-major party vote. Again, to reflect on the current day, we can see in the way in which Peter Dutton has released today's policy and been framing other approaches, that we won't be facing a small target approach at the next election. We will be presenting a vision for the future of the nation. We will be arguing that we have policies that present a true contrast and address the structural problems the country faces and contribute to the global challenges that we acknowledge need addressing. And in doing so, we will hope to capture a positive sense of the nation, that there is vision, and there are solutions within our policies and the approaches that we are taking forward. But again, we can be mindful of biting off too much. Arguably, Dr. Kemp served an extra term in opposition after the Liberal National Parties under the leadership of John Hewson bit off too much. Arguably, Bill Shorten would have been Prime Minister had he not allowed Chris Bowen and the Labor Party of the day to bite off too much. And so, as we embark upon an ambitious policy agenda as an opposition today, it is mindful that oppositions don't want elections to be purely about themselves. And so there is a circularity to the view that yes, you need to present the vision and the alternate policies for the country, but that can never be at the expense of demonstrating the scrutiny of government, the failure of those government policies, and within that failure of those policies, the role of the government of the day in failing to achieve the outcomes for the Australian people. Now, of course, all of that works wonderfully well in a world of static politics and events. But as Harold Macmillan famously referenced, governments are shaped by events, dear boy, events. And whether they are the events of a global pandemic, whether they are events of a terrorist attack, or whether they are events that we have not contemplated yet, all of us need to be aware that what we think the people will be voting on today may not necessarily be what they will be voting on when an election comes around in 3, 6 or 9 months' time. And therein, of course, lies the challenge to be ready for all possible events and scenarios. And again, the work in the book to compare the resourcing of governments versus the resourcing of oppositions demonstrates the challenge that exists for oppositions to be ready, to be nimble, to be agile. The challenge to get the decision right as to whether to release a policy like a nuclear policy some distance from an election or with greater proximity to that election. Each of these challenges are ones for which there is no perfect answer, but for which judgment, experience must guide the decisions of the day. So, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I want to express deep thanks to Scott, David, and all of the contributors for shining a light on a little considered part of our democracy, but an essential part of our democratic structure. Lord Norton, in his introduction, describes the book as a magisterial study. Now, no matter how hard I try, there's no matching such praise, short of perhaps pronouncing beatification. But I do want to acknowledge that it is a thought-provoking, a considered, and an invaluable contribution to our public debate, and to that I hope will be considered upon by parliamentarians in states and territories and elsewhere around the world. That it does cause you to step back and think about the fundamental challenges and questions that as oppositions you need to address, and about how it is you weight and give balance to the different responsibilities that you have as an opposition. And for that, it is a very worthy contribution, a welcome one, and I'm very delighted to have this opportunity to speak at its launch. Thank you very much, Scott.
Thank you so much, Simon. And of course, we couldn't have picked better timing with the opposition announcing such a bold policy today, and of course, really acting as a case study on the art of opposition and how we might see that balance between having a rich policy offering as an alternative versus allowing just the government to lose the election and going to an election with very little in terms of a manifesto. So I'm very, very much looking forward to seeing how this case study plays out, and I think it's a rich and worthy debate that this country needs to have. So very, very welcome for the policy debate to take place, and thank you for that wonderful, wonderful analysis of Scott's book. I had the pleasure of recording a podcast prior to this event tonight with Scott, so I have a pretty good idea of what he's going to say tonight. But Scott Prasser is an absolute powerhouse as an author, a policy analyst. I don't know how many books you've written, Scott, but you literally seem to have a new book out every week, I feel. I don't think this man ever sleeps. He makes, well, look, if we ever thought we had a productivity problem in Australia, which we do, Scott is definitely the answer to it. Scott has worked as a senior policy advisor in both state and federal governments. He is incredibly experienced in politics, and he's also worked at 5 different universities in academic positions, so incredibly experienced at thinking and analysing our nation's challenges, and of course has put this wonderful magisterial even book together over a period of 13 years, which is no mean feat for your persistence, Scott. So thank you. I'll cede the floor to Scott to say a few words.
Thanks, Regina, and thanks, Simon, very much. The idea for this book came from a person called John Nethercote, who died a few years ago, and we ran a conference in Canberra in 2011, and we had all sorts of contributors come in, and this was, and a lot of chapters then flowed, and this was John's baby, but John's baby was never delivered, for all sorts of reasons. So, and by that time I'd moved on to work for federal politicians, so my time was gone. But the publisher, Connor Court, Anthony Capella, kept every now and again ringing me, Scott, you should revive that, opposition book, I said, I'm too busy. And as years went on, I said, well, look, I don't know where those people are now. If I rang them up, they'd probably abuse me. What happened to their book, and so on. And about a year ago, he rang me again. He said, have you got any of the chapters? I said, I've got all the original chapters. And I said, look, I'll do a promise. I'll bring one person up, and if they tell me to get lost, we won't persist. And he said, okay. So this one person was Graham Maddox. He was at University of New England. I rang the University of New England. No one had ever heard of him. He was an emeritus professor, but he retired. So
never heard of. Sorry for forgetting.
That's right. So I happened to have his home phone number in Armidale. So I rang at 7:30 at night, and I got Graham. Hi, Graham. It's Scott here, and I was expecting him to put the phone down and get lost. I said, Graham, did you ever do that chapter you wrote for John? No, I never did it. I saw John a couple of years ago, and he said it was coming out. I said, well, I hate to tell you this, but Graham, John is no longer with us. Right. I said, would you be prepared to update it and go to book? I promise we'll do this book. He said, definitely. So I then started to ring everyone else up, including a German academic and so on. And I found that some people had never done anything with their chapter, and a number were prepared to redraft it. So 7 of the chapters are the sort of original chapters. Then we thought we should really widen it out. And what was interesting when I started ringing people, and why this book is 480 pages, is I thought I'd get a lot of knockbacks, and everyone I rang said yes. So that's why there is a chapter on every state, which we didn't have before. We've also got some international chapters, one on the United States, we've got one on Canada, 2 on the United Kingdom, and so on. And we went on sort of comparing European countries. So everyone said yes. So that's why the book has become so big, and why it's very heavy to carry around. But also what everyone is saying to me Scott, no one's done a book on oppositions like this, especially in the Australian context. So we thought there was interest in it. I went back to the publisher and said, yes, it's a goer. David Clune, who I know I've done already one other book on the Whitlam period, was game enough to work with me again, which meant many phone calls at all sorts of times of night. I don't sleep, it's true. David found this very strange. And so we've got a book of 12 so professors. We cover a number of different jurisdictions. We've got a former senior public servant of a chapter. We've got a person who's chief of staff of 3 opposition leaders in Queensland. We've been in opposition a long time in Queensland, which is what happens. And we've got international ones. And I wanted one in the United States, and there's the contributor who's a president of a university in the United States who's done work with me on royal commissions and inquiries. And it's very important because the United States doesn't have a formal opposition as such, but it has lots of opposition, okay, right? You just got to go there very quickly and see what it's like. So that's sort of fruition, and certainly we've done quite a bit of promotion to try and get the book out. But I think Simon hit on a couple of really interesting points, which is raging all the time. For those of you Southerners don't understand what's happening in Queensland, we've got an election coming up in Queensland, and the debate going on is the small target versus the big target sort of debate going on. Now, I'm in the let's take them on, let's make war camp, if you like. I don't like a soft approach. And I thought, very interesting, I was going through my newspaper clippings, which my wife is urging me all the time to throw out, and I found my Catherine West file. And those who know Catherine West, she wrote the first book, academic book, on the Liberal Party called Power in the Liberal Party in 1965. Her father, by the way, was Sir Harold White, the head of the Parliamentary Library, who convinced Menzies to set up the National Library. So there's quite a connection. Catherine West wrote quite a few articles, and unfortunately she also got tangled up in that Joe for Canberra campaign. Another great Queensland initiative sort of thing. So anyway, I sort of came across this article written about this time in 1985 by Catherine West. Now this was the time when Andrew Peacock, who had almost defeated Hawke in the 84 early election, remember, Andrew Peacock made a big mistake. You know, he decided to sack John Howard as his deputy. Big mistake, right? Why? Because John Howard was highly competent. But Catherine West brings out the 2 different approaches. Andrew Peacock was a great campaigner, but a bit light on the policy, right? He sort of thought the opposition will get in on the mistakes of the government of the day. While on contrary, John Howard was more the policy person, who was also very good on the parliamentary tactics. They both sort of needed each other, okay? And by attempting to sack John Howard, you all know what happened. John Howard became the leader, okay? That's what happened. So a really bad mistake. We know that Andrew Peacock came back in 1989 and didn't win the subsequent election. But there you got the 2 contrary viewpoints about policy. In Queensland, they're raging at the moment the opposition, LNP, which is this amalgamation of the Liberal Party, the junior party in Queensland in the coalition, and the National Party, really the Country Party, are been in opposition since 2015, 9 years, and their complaint is that they've adopted a low target sort of strategy, and that is sort of starting to come a bit unstuck. So a couple of weeks ago, the leader of the opposition in Queensland, Mr. Christopher, he said they would agree with the government's budget, regardless of what was in it, completely. They want to have stability and so on. Now, this has caused that the newspapers are causing quite a bit of ruckus on this issue. So it's very interesting to see this being played out. And I do agree with Simon that there's got to be some sort of balance between these 2. But Mr. Menzies, since we're in Mr. Menzies' house, so to speak, did say 3 things, I think, about oppositions. 1, you can't attack the government on everything. There are sometimes governments do good things or right things, okay? So that's one of the things he said. Also, if you just come across as a opposition, never agree to anything, you're going to be called a whinger and complainer. But he did make this very good point. Somewhere along the way, you're going to have to present an alternative, and somewhere along the way, you're going to have to be different from the government of the day. Because if you're not different from the government of the day, why would your base support you? Why would we go and hand out vote cards for you? And I really am glad that Dutton is putting things out there and doing what he's doing. My son is, by the way, a nuclear energy fan. I don't quite know why this is, but he is. And so he's probably celebrating with champagne tonight, I'm not sure. I hope he doesn't get too radioactive, that's all I can say. Can I just thank Georgina and also all the contributors to this book. Dealing with 21 authors, 6 of them overseas, is sometimes a bit of fun. But I always say to people, when you are going to join up with me, just remember, I will follow it up, and I will drive you crazy until you deliver. And that's how the book's got to happen. So thanks very much for coming.
So we're going to do a little teeny tiny Q&A, which hopefully Simon knew about. Not sure if you did, but anyway, I'm not going to be Tony Jones. Don't worry. I think there's a long cord here, and then Terry, who's one of the contributors, is going to close off with a few final remarks. So I thought I would start with you, Simon, and ask. So there's a reference in the book to the perfect opposition being a combination of mongrel and statesman. And I was reflecting on that quote because I didn't think that was very Menzian, mongrel and statesman, but maybe mongrel wasn't part of the patois of the 60s, perhaps. But what is the perfect opposition leader? Peter Dutton.
That's right.
Peter Dutton.
Well, yes. Thanks, Roger. I think the perfect opposition leader is the person who can balance the type of issues and approach that Scott and I both touched on that comes through in the book. Now, in a personality sense, again, different approaches will come to the fore. Scott just ran a consideration of Peacock v. Howard, and of course Howard ultimately succeeded. And as the years went by, and as an incumbent Howard won again and again, he's now viewed as an amazing campaigner as well as effective policy, detailed, strategist, governing leader. But the approach of different opposition leaders does vary wildly. Obviously, Tony brought to 2013, after the close call of 2010, a relentlessness. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a mongrel, but a relentlessness in terms of the bringing down of the Gillard-Rudd government. And in doing so was very, very successful. But, as I touched on in terms of Scott's chapter there, perhaps with such an eye to victory, the promises made, no cuts to help education or, heaven forbid, even the ABC, came back to bite versus the lack of sufficient clarity or ambition of other policy. Now, no government, even in our short 3-year terms, nor opposition, can foresee everything they're going to encounter in the next 3 years. So you can never rely entirely upon mandate. But I do think mandate provides a basis for your credibility as a government and for you to point to some of your deliverables against your promises. And so for an opposition leader, setting up that balance the right way is important. And in Peter, I guess what we certainly are seeing is a relentlessness to go after the government's broken promises, to make sure that as we have now moved past their third budget and where Australia has gone from having one of the lowest core inflation rates relative to comparable economies in the world to having one of the highest core inflation rates relative to comparable economies in the world, we start to pin that on the government, but we present a strong, viable, alternative policy manifesto to give ourselves a mandate. And everybody will bring their own tone and style to how they go about that, but I think that's the essential balance.
Thanks, Simon. If you wouldn't mind handing Scott the microphone, I'm going to now ask Scott about our friends the Teals. So I actually am about to move into a Teal, not move in, I'm being moved into a Teal seat. My seat's being abolished and I get to move into Kooyong apparently. So this is going to be of particular interest to me. The idea of the loyal opposition, the development of formal opposition through the history of the Westminster system has really relied on this strong two-party system. And I know when we were talking before, you quoted an election result, I think it was Whitlamira, where the two major parties got 90% of the vote. And the most recent election, the two major parties got about 65%. So it's a big change, right? How does the rise of the Teals, the minor parties, how does their presence in the Parliament affect the role of the opposition, the art of opposition? How do you handle that?
Well, I think it only works where there's an upper house, where the Teals or the minor parties can get a place. Then they can exert. Now, in Queensland we have, you probably don't know, there are two members called the Katter Party in the Queensland Parliament. Right? Bob, of course, is the federal member for up north, and a delightful person he is. But the two Katter members, one of them is his son, so it's keeping it in the family, but they have no influence on what goes on in Queensland Parliament. Right? So that's one issue. And the Teals I've seen not to have any influence either in federal parliament in what they've done. It's more the fear that they're coming, so on. Now, I myself don't think they're a long-lasting phenomena. That's my view. Other people disagree with me, because I think they reflect a certain disaffection of a lot of people with all major political parties. And I'm giving a talk in a week's time to a community group who want more independence and more Teal-like people. And I said, well, you've got to be careful of what you wish for that you might get. They said, what do you mean? I said, you could end up with a whole stack of independents and you have government inertia. The virtue of the two-party system, where one winner gets the prize and can make decisions and can initiate. And Australia's done a pretty fantastic job in managing our economy and managing things compared to a lot of other countries, I would have thought. It's been a pretty fantastic achievement. So compared, I think better than a lot of other countries. So if we have too many people in that independent position, too many of the Jackie Lambie party and all the other parties that are around, who you don't know what they're going to vote for in the future, because they don't have an ideology or a philosophy, they are going, issue by issue. Right? So I think that's a real danger. But the major parties have got to not lose sight of their base. I had a view, a very strong view, that if the Liberal Party, the coalition, had come out in favour of the voice, the Liberal Party would be finished. That's my view. Okay? Now, I could be wrong, because the base was basically in the no camp. That's understandable. So I think when you get into government, you sometimes lose sight of the base. Now, I don't mean becoming ideological or extreme or that sort of thing, but you've got to appeal to your base. Catherine West, in her ABC AM program with John Howard, just after they lost the 83 election, John Howard was talking about, leadership changes, and said, John, you've got to talk more than about leadership changes. You've got a Hawke government which is moving to the right. So you can't expect to attack the Labor Party on their sort of left-wing sort of approach anymore. You've got to come up with more innovative policies. And you should read some of Catherine West's stuff about innovative, conservative welfare policies and so on. There is such a thing. So I think we should be very careful about overreacting. And I think my friend Nick Economo used to be at Monash University. So why do the political parties take their cue from the inner city? That's not where people live. That's not where the issues are. What did Menzies do? Menzies in 1940s, everyone was banging on about social housing, following the British sort of model of, those great big conglomerations they built. He went for home ownership, the home, right? Who was right? I know academics were saying, oh, fancy living in suburbia. People would lose their working class background. People want to live in suburbia and they want to have their little tiny block of land and their garage and whatever. And Menzies was right and his policies encouraged it, and he went against the stream and he was proved right. And I think that's the lesson.
So we have time for one last quick question, so you're going to be my final victim, Simon, before we hand to Terry. Losing government, becoming the opposition, you lose not just your lovely office, which you have to give to Penny, but you also lose your government department.
Incidentally, Penny claims that
Yes.
my office is nicer than hers. I've said I'm happy to swap back any time she wants.
Yes, with all the trimmings, no doubt. But you lose your government department, which is a huge resource. How difficult is it to shift gears into an opposition, and with the lack of resources too? And I know Liz, I've lost you. There you are, Liz. Liz's chapter is on resourcing for oppositions, and it's controversial, and I think it's come down quite a bit over time. You'll correct me, Liz, but you're moving from having thousands of people potentially working for you to it might just be you and a couple of policy advisors, luckily as smart and hardworking as Scott.
Hopefully, but there are few who meet those standards, but some amazing people who do toil away in opposition and who do even make the transition with MPs and senators from government into opposition because of their deep faith and commitment. It's challenging, but I think also, and you quoted Menzies in the introduction tonight, Georgina, that there is also one part of resourcing that is freed up in opposition. Even perhaps more than one part. Your mind is freed up a little more. Your diary is freed up a little more. And they're not things that you wish for, but they definitely do provide the scope to apply yourself to thinking through the problems, sometimes with a little more clarity, to casting aside the great mountain of briefs that will endlessly come through, that is the role of the department to keep the minister busy, not necessarily to keep the minister focused on reform, but to keep the minister occupied. And so, in that sense, you have to seize the opportunities that are there. Now, there is no doubt there is a great imbalance. Some of it, the work of the Parliamentary Library and its establishment from a long time ago, provides some critical resourcing. The establishment of the Parliamentary Budget Office does provide some important resourcing, and especially does so in an era where it is important that oppositions have the resources to ensure their policies withstand scrutiny. That is your great fear in many ways in opposition, that you go through the work of consulting on a policy, you go through the effort of developing it in a manner that is consistent with your beliefs, philosophical traditions, but is also, you think, clearly addressing an objective problem and challenge the nation faces and will be a significant reform. But then will the detail of that withstand scrutiny? Will it withstand scrutiny to the costings, to the economic implications, to the other factors that it is seeking to assess? And you know that a government will find some clever and cunning way to use the resources of government to have departments model a hypothetical policy that may look and sound an awful lot like what you're developing, and that they will be looking to find ways with all of those resources they have to be able to model it. So the advent of things like the library, like the budget office, are important additions to the resourcing. I think the imbalance probably has grown somewhat over time, particularly as the growth of political staff has grown over time. So even during an election campaign environment, and I think this is even more acute at state and territory levels, during an election campaign environment, you have the situation where, hopefully, if the public service is doing its job, it does shut the government off from access to those resources to an extent. But having significantly more political staff nowadays, which are weighted usually at least 80-20 towards the government, often more so, that gives an enormous additional resource, whether it's deployed for red shirts in the most blunt form, or whether it is deployed in terms of actually policy resourcing, the ability to cost and run your policies through an election campaign. There's an imbalance, and it's a growing challenge, and one that I think, as I said, we haven't touched much on the disparities at the state and territory level, but I think the issues that line up at the state and territory elections have historically tended to favour the Labor Party, and we haven't been good at combating that across a range of jurisdictions. But also now, in this day and age, I think what has made it even harder in the last 10 to 20 years is, if there's one extra chapter for the next edition, Scott, a bigger focus on the role of the media together with opposition. Because as much as we may loathe and detest working with the media at times, without them, the work of oppositions becomes often quite pointless and ineffective. And I think what has frequently crippled state oppositions is that there is very little scrutiny and coverage of state politics nowadays, and very little opportunity for them to sustain a campaign against state governments, even when the most outrageous things are occurring. And I think that shows just how important the media is as part of that fourth estate functioning in a way to enable a formal opposition to do its job.
Yeah, here. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Scott. I'd now like to ask Terry Barnes, one of the contributors to the Art of Opposition, to say a few words. I'm going to put this microphone back here for you, Terry.
Oh, thank you.
It's a pleasure, Terry.
Well. Actually, I lost the middle page of my talking points on the way here, so I think that's an omen. But actually,
Have a great start and end it.
well, I remember boss I used to work with, Michael Woodbridge, said that he had a bit of a row with one of his staff, and the speech started, blah, 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 end of page one, now you're on your own. Well, the other thing about being a quick last speaker is that most of what I wanted to say has already been said. I think what Simon was just saying about state politics is absolutely where I wanted to go in talking about the importance of this book, looking at the state level of opposition in a way that I don't think has really happened in Australia. Correct me if I'm wrong, Scott. But also, I think having a deep critical look at how oppositions work in each state, and I think that's something that I commend to you all. And I'd certainly like to commend to you a certain chapter about Victorian Liberals in opposition in Victoria. I think it says, the title is the Victorian Liberals 1999 to 2023, a permanent opposition with a question mark. And I'm actually starting to wonder if it's a typo. I think that should be a full stop the way things are going. And I think part of the problem is that what we have in Victoria at the moment is a case study in oppositions who get so used to being in opposition, not simply because of their own fault, but because of circumstances, those events, dear boy events, that they're totally bogged down, they're totally lost, they're totally unfocused, they're totally, except when it comes to focusing on each other and themselves and tearing each other apart. They're failing to do the basic thing, which I think has come out of what both Scott and Simon have said, which is if you want to be in government, as an opposition, you have to present yourself as an alternative government. It's not just policies, that's in terms of your people, it's in terms of your conduct, it's in terms of your organisation. And in Victoria at the moment, and I think for some years, not decades even now, and you've got to remember that the Liberals or the Coalition has been in opposition for, I think, all but 11 of the last 40 odd years. We talk about 1999, but really we're going back to 1982. And in a sense, Victoria in opposition is creating a case study in terms of how not to do it. And I think it's not just our federal colleagues, but it's also our state colleagues around the country who have to actually look at Victoria and say, well, we don't want to go there, or we might end up like them. Or the only other people in certainly the Liberal world, Liberal family, I feel sorry for are our friends in the ACT, who I don't think will ever make it back into government in any way. But it's important to focus on policy, yes. It's also important to focus on presentation. It's also important to focus on unity. One of the things that I've been impressed with the federal opposition, Simon, is that you've all kept together. You've stayed united. You've kept any bickering behind closed doors. Whereas in Victoria, we're not seeing that. We're seeing it all spilled out. And the media does take an interest in opposition when oppositions make themselves interesting. And that's the problem that we have had down here for far too long. And it's important, I think, not just to energise the base, as Scott was saying, but it's also to energise those undecided voters in between who are willing and able and prepared to jump ship if only they have a ship to jump to. And I think it's very important that it doesn't matter, we're talking about the Liberal Party, but we're also talking about the Labor Party. I mean, whoever is in opposition has to provide that alternative, has to provide a constructive choice in terms of policies, in terms of manifesto, but also in terms of showing that they can actually deliver once they get there. And for too long, and in Victoria, I think, our last two elections have been referendums, not on the government's performance, and that's notwithstanding COVID, notwithstanding everything else, it's been a referendum on the performance of the opposition. And until the current opposition can get past that, until it realises, has a bit of self-awareness about what it is doing, not just to itself, but to all those who want to best their hopes in it, we're going to get nowhere. We're going to get nowhere. And I think it's something that those who go into opposition, and I've worked in opposition as well as government, is that you have to have the self-awareness to know where you've gone wrong as where you want to go right. I think I'm seeing that federally in terms of looking critically at what you did in government, and I think that's very important. But I think down here at the state level, lessons have not been worked. I mean, David Kemp wrote a brilliant post-mortem report on the 2014 election result. And what was the first recommendation Tony Nutt did for the 2019 review, David? Adopt your report. It's still gathering dust on the shelves of what we used to lovingly call 104. That we have to move on. We have to grow. We have to keep growing. But the voting public needs to see that as well. I write in my chapter, because that chapter in question was my chapter, so I go straight to it if I were you. I write at the end of the chapter that I often joke that I'm a late developer in many ways. My wife would say I'm a non-developer, but I have a 5-year-old, believe it or not, and she's a very smart, very intelligent little girl. And I often joke that she is the next Liberal Premier of Victoria. But the way things are travelling, the way things are going, and the way that lessons of being in opposition as well as being in government and defeated have not been learnt in Victoria, I think the joke's going to be on all of us. So thanks very much for asking me to have a quick few final words.
Thanks, Terry. I wonder if that's what all those Labor opposition leaders felt like when Menzies was Prime Minister. Must have been a very, 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 very long time to fight election after election and fail. I wanted to say a huge thank you to all for coming out tonight. You would have seen on your seat our upcoming events flyer. We have a really, really fun event next month on the Scottish Enlightenment with some fabulous speakers such as Stuart Gill, who's here tonight, Zach Gorman, and a Scottish Enlightenment philosopher here at Melbourne University, Mark Mirowski. But we also have whisky tasting that evening as well, because it's the Melbourne Tartan Festival, so it'll be a very festive event. We have an event in, I think, very pertinent to tonight's discussion in August on the future of the two-party system. It's a launch event for a dialogue we're having the next day with a smaller group of people, and I really encourage you to come along to that. I think it'll be fascinating, and it's so pertinent. On the 23rd of October, we have our oration, our annual oration, which is this year to be delivered by Neil Ferguson. Many of you will know him. He's another Scot. Last year we had Fraser Nelson, who was a Scot, and this year we've got Neil Ferguson, the Scottish historian and a real superstar. And of course, for the academically inclined in the room, we have our fourth conference, the 23rd and 24th of November. But the most important thing is we are running our end of financial year campaign at the moment, and would love a donation if you can spare one and have the capacity. There's forms here. Please do consider us. In the last 10 days or so, Christina is around who can take your donation forms, and all donations, great, small, and in the middle, are so gratefully received. We really can't do all the things we do without your support, so really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Simon.